Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Really nice to see you. I'm Filsan Omar Isman, and I'll be the moderator for this evening. So let's begin with a few practical information and a little bit of an introduction. The event is organized by Studium Generale. Studium Generale Gent is a platform created by Hogeschool Gent and CASC that provides university and college students, lecturers, and interested parties with a forum for reflection on society, art, culture, and science. It does so by organizing around 10 lectures, discussions, or stage programs each year. Studium Generale can be taken as an elective course by all students of the Ghent University Association, Ho-Gent, Ho-West, CASC, and Conservatorium. Tonight, we'll be in conversation with Professor Dr. Sabrina Strings about fatphobia and misogynoir. Dr. Strings is a professor at the North Hall and a North Hall Chair of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She was a recipient of the UC Berkeley Chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship with a joint appointment in the School of Public Health and the Department of Sociology. She's also a certified yoga teacher. Her work on yoga has been featured in the Feminist Wire, Yoga International, and LA Yoga. Dr. Strings is also an award-winning author with publications in diverse venues, including Ethnic and Racial Studies, Science, Journal of Women and Culture, in Culture and Society, Fat Studies, an interdisciplinary journal of body weight and society, and feminist media studies. Her first book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia, published by NYU Press in 2019, and the book we'll be talking about tonight, was named one of Essence Magazine's 10 books we are dying to toss into our summer totes. It also made the must-read list in Miss Magazine, Color Lines, and Bitch Media, and has been featured on NPR, KPFA, and WNYC. Her latest book, The End of Love, Racism, Sexism, and the Death of Romance, was released by Beacon Press in January of 2024 and has been featured in Miss Magazine and The Atlantic, NPR, and the hit show Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. I think that one is on Netflix. We will start the night off with a lecture by Dr. Strings, followed by a short conversation with me. Don't worry, you'll get your chance to ask her questions after that, so get your pens and papers out and start writing. There will be a small important announcement. This event is being filmed. So this means that any questions you ask or might ask will also be filmed, but it's also only going to be made available to the students in the room with us now. I've also been asked to announce another event on the 29th of April in the Mired Concertzaal, where Bieke Prunel will be hosting a book launch. The event is called The Geknevelde Lichaam, so you're very much welcome to be there as well. All right, now that the introduction and the practical information is out of the way, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Sabrina Strings to the stage.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Fasan. And thank you all for being here for this talk and conversation. Hello? Okay, good. This one works too. So the title of my talk is Fatphobia as Misogynoir. And I think they wanted you to be apprised of the other events that are going on. And I believe that one of them was already announced. And so then you have another reminder that there are very exciting things that you should try to take advantage of if you can. So people often wonder how an individual who would not be classified as fat, such as myself, became interested in this topic. I consider myself a straight-sized ally or accomplice to the fat liberation movement. And my interest in this has a lot to do with my upbringing. So this is representation of a typical Black family during what was known as the Great Migration in the United States. So the Great Migration took place between approximately 1916 to 1970, and it was the first time after the end of slavery in which scores of Black people had the right to leave the American plantation South. When they did so in the early waves, they headed to the Northeast, places like New York. Later, they went to the Midwest, Chicago, and in the last wave, around the 60s and 70s, people were making their way to California. My family, not pictured here, this is just a stock Black family, but my family actually made the trek during the Great Migration. In 1960, my maternal grandmother bundled up her little nuclear family, leaving the South, Atlanta, Georgia, and heading to Los Angeles, California. My grandmother's grandmother was a slave. So we often talk about slavery like it was so long ago, right? I'm only 5 generations removed from slavery. My grandmother herself was born during the Great Depression. And one of the things that she said is that when she was a kid, one of her happiest memories was that she once got a basket of oranges. Can you imagine? In other words, it was highly irregular for Black people when she was growing up to have regular access to food. People weren't concerned about so-called eating too much. So you can imagine my grandmother's surprise when she arrived in Los Angeles, California, and was living and working around a bunch of white people for the first time in her life. And she noticed that quite a few of the white women that she met were on diets. And she was like, what? What is this? This is a representation of a popular so-called reducing regime in the 1940s in America. I have no idea what these contraptions are or what these people think they're doing, but we can all rest assured that they're not effective. So in the middle of the 1990s, when I was a young teenager, my grandmother, who had been having this question about all these people who are on diets for decades, decided to start drawing me into the conversation. She'd be like, oh, Sabrina, come here. And I'd be like, what? Oh, what? Now look at Victoria. Victoria is a character on a soap opera known as Young and the Restless. And I'll be like, what? She'd be like, Victoria is killing herself to be thin. Why are these white women dying to be thin? And I was like, oh, I don't know. Can I get a cupcake? Because I was a teenager, and that's what I cared about. And this is not Victoria. I couldn't find an actual picture of that woman during that era, but this is an actress on the very same soap opera from this period. So you can see that these were women who were cultivating extremely slender physiques. So unfortunately, my grandmother passed away in 2000. But as I started to grow older, it became important for me to think through some of the questions that she had been asking. And so I started to say, like, wait a minute, why is this a big deal? And one of the things that was an impetus for me taking her question seriously finally was that in approximately 2003, I was living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was working at an HIV medication adherence clinic. And on one day in which I was asked to interview 2 of the women who were taking HIV medications about their regularity and adherence, they both told me that they were afraid of taking their HIV meds because they did not want to gain weight. Significantly, these women were a Black woman and a Latina. They were women of color. Hearing them say that just blew my wig clean off. I thought, wait, the stakes are life and death. You are willing to risk death in order to so-called maintain your figure. So that is what led me to decide that I wanted to start researching this in earnest. So when I first started doing the research, I was like, okay, well, this must be a modern problem, right? I mean, surely people haven't always been concerned about looking this particular way. I was like, I'm pretty sure that Marilyn Monroe was thick, so it must have been sometime between 1950 and 1960. I quickly began to realize just how far off I was historically. And so this is a representation of some of the popular culture influences that I had when I was working on my dissertation, which is called Thin, White, and Saved. This is from Mean Girls, the classic, the original, okay? And if you haven't seen this, get your life together. This is an American classic, I just explained that. One of the things that is fascinating to me now is that in this particular film, they're trying to suggest that it's really important to lose 3 pounds. And consider the fact that if you saw this film around the time it came out, right, early to mid-aughts, it probably didn't even faze you. You probably weren't remotely like, why would you lose 3 pounds? Because in the Western world, especially during the early and mid-aughts, it was just expected that people were supposed to be on diets. Everyone was told they were supposed to be trying to be as thin as possible, right? It's only in recent years that I started to reflect on the insanity of this movie in which she's supposed to be losing 3 pounds, but her rival forces her to gain 5 pounds, right? None of this makes any sense, except for the fact that Western culture valorizes the idea that people need to be very disciplined with what they eat so that their bodies look a particular way. So it turns out I was wrong. It was not in the 1950s or 60s that the slender aesthetic captured the Western imagination. As I was doing my research, I pretty quickly came across images such as this. So this is an image from Harper's Bazaar from 1897. And this is an image of Blake Lively from 2015. Imagine my surprise when I just happened to notice these two images around the same time. The similarities are striking, right? You need to be quite skinny. Make sure that the waist is fully snatched. You should have a long skirts and heels, right? There's just such a similarity between these two images. It's what we call in the business the simulacrum. It's the repetition upon the repetition upon the repetition of an idea, such that it feels new. Because, well, you've never seen this Harper's Bazaar image before in your life. But if you're aware of the culture, you will understand that all they're doing is putting new models within an old aesthetic idea. So when I went to write the book, I was like, okay, well, if I know that in the United States, already by 1897, this was the ideal, then where did it come from? I was like, well, I know that in the Renaissance, that voluptuous and curvaceous women were prized, right? And I don't have to tell you that, right? I'm sure quite a few of you will recognize this image. This is from Peter Paul Rubens. This is called Venus in Front of the Mirror. It's supposed to be a representation of the goddess Venus in all of her bodaciousness, right? She's got her undulating curves and her backside presented to us for us to admire. She's also got a small cherub holding up a mirror, right? Reminding her of her own beauty. And there's even a small and slender black girl in the corner of the frame, presented to us as a counterpoint, right? Who is also admiring her beauty. Now, evidently, this is still a racial problem. This is before the term race as we use it today was invented, but it doesn't mean that they weren't trying to make distinctions amongst attractive and unattractive bodies, right? So you might notice that when the ideal was that women should be curvaceous, it was white women who represented that, and black women who were seen as small and slender and really not having enough body. But in the 18th century, which many people regard as the height of the slave trade, something else happened. They realized that it was no longer possible just to use skin color in the colonies to determine who should be slave and who should be free. There was too much, well, illicit racial mixing going on. So they started to dream up new ways to identify who were the people who were whites and who were the people who were black. We call that today race science. Now, the race scientists were saying, you know what? Africans are just greedy eaters. There was a French Enlightenment theorist by the name of J.J. Verret, and he claimed that black people were mindless, self-gratifying automatons. They were just given up to the pleasures of the table. He said, those great eaters, intemperate epicures who seem to live only to eat have a stupid look. Always digesting, they become incapable of thinking. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Saartjie Baartman, the so-called Hottentot Venus. You may also realize that the so-called Hottentot people were given that moniker by the Dutch, who colonized South Africa. Originally, they were known as and still are, the Khoisan people. Right? So, according to J.J. Verret, the so-called Hottentot women develop big butts and bellies that push out. He said the derrieres of Hottentot women resembled that of four-legged creatures, at times growing so large that they could be supported with a small cart, like a domesticated animal. Now here he's calling on something known as the Great Chain of Being. That suggested that there was one line of humanity that extended from just beneath God, right, and that was white guys, all the way down the chain to the lowest of humans, and that was Africans, right above four-legged creatures. Right? So this would have been popular scientific ideas in the 17th century that he was drawing on to make his claims in the 18th. And J.J. Verret, in his book, The Natural History of Mankind, chose to put an image of the plaster cast of Saartjie Baartman on the cover. Now, if you don't know much about Saartjie Baartman, she was born at the Cape of South Africa, sometime in the late 18th century. No one knows for sure exactly when. She was born free. But when the Dutch and the English arrived, subsequently she was enslaved. Now, during her enslavement, there was an Englishman by the name of Alexander Dunlop who actually saw her because she had been taken by her colored handler and being used as a so-called infirmary delight. She would be put on display at a hospital to dance for dying soldiers, like one last kiss of pleasure before heading to the hereafter. So when an English colonist happened to see her do her infirmary dance once, he was like, oh, I got to get her to Europe. I can make a killing. So he purchased her, and he took her to England and France and put her on display. Now, when the whole idea is to show that there are different species of human, you're going to want to try to truss it up. You want to try to magnify the so-called differences. And so there are many different ways in which Saartjie Baartman's body appears, right, in different billings, as people are trying to make different claims about her. In this one, she is being adorned with a variety of different jewels and a headdress and a bunch of other garb that's supposed to signal Africanity, but is in fact just nonsense that colonists thought looked African. There was also a lore about her, which is that she was 3 yards and 3/4 round. And it was the size and shape of her body, according to the people who put her on display, that made her a perfect specimen of Africanity. Such a counterpoint to the disciplined white people. And so I chose to put an image of Saartjie Baartman on the cover of my book to reveal what would have happened at a typical exhibit. Usually she would be brought into a dark enclosure. At a certain moment, a crowd would be allowed in. Now, keeping in mind that this is the early 19th century, and the way the triangle slave trade worked is that Africans were taken from their homeland, and then they were usually brought to a colony, right? So that the colonists went from Europe to Africa, and then they were taken to a colony. It was rare that Black people, and especially Black women, made it back to Europe. So she was an oddity and a curiosity. People were so excited to come in and see her. So they would file into a dark enclosure, and they would wait. At a certain moment, her handler would shake a cord, and she would come out and charge the crowd, like you see here. This is a painting that was done in 1831 by a man named Sebastian Coeur, who inevitably went to one such event. And it's important for me to point out for you here that anti-Blackness is often misunderstood as just hatred. We let ourselves off the hook when we think it's just hatred, because we don't hate anyone. No, anti-Blackness is really about the nexus of desire and disdain. So notice how people are turning away in horror. Oh my gosh, even as one guy has his glasses on to get a better look, right? To be disgusted and titillated at the same time. That's the nexus of anti-Blackness. And unfortunately for Saartjie Baartman, she was the first Black woman that many Europeans had to place this type of energy upon. So a few key early points. Fatness was once prized in the West, but the rise of slavery and race science led to the denigration of fatness because people believed it was related to blackness. Simultaneously, it suggested that white people were thin and that white people's beauty ideal should be a slender aesthetic. So that only approximately 100 years after the Rubens image that I showed you previously, we have this, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews from Thomas Gainsborough, 1750. Notice how different the model of beauty. She is slender, her features are quiet, she's demure, right? And she's also standing next to her man. This is supposed to be the restraint that is indicative of white superiority. Now, even before I began doing my own independent empirical research into this topic, there were many people who had already shown that the thin ideal in the Western world took off par excellence in the United States. And this is a representation of as much. Now, this is from the #1 women's magazine in the United States in the 19th century, known as Godey's Lady's Book. Okay. And you'll notice also the clothing, perhaps reminiscent of Harper's or Blake Lively, right? Very similar idea. And this is actually 60 years before the Harper's image. And in this magazine, they were trying to teach women the rules of propriety. And so they would say things like, the Anglo-Saxon race of women are taller and slenderer, and if we may credit history, far more lovely. Now, interestingly, the slenderer that they're using here is supposed to be a counterpoint to the goddess Venus that we also saw in the Rubens painting, right? So in other words, they imagine themselves to be even more beautiful than the goddess. And they added, in some parts of Africa, no lady can be charming under 21 stone, right? So the idea is that within spaces that are controlled by people from Africa, that there was a desire for largesse that was somehow completely outside of what was considered civilized for white persons. How many of you have seen this image before? Okay, handful of you. Yeah. This is an image by a cartoonist known as Edward Williams Clay. It's very popular. I'm not surprised that there are those of you who've seen it here. It's supposed to be a representation of a typical impoverished black man after slavery. And the reason why this was drawn was to suggest that, isn't it outrageous that white people have to interact with these kinds of poor, low-class individuals? So even though you've seen this, I doubt you've seen this one. This is an image by the same artist. In fact, he was extremely prolific in representing images of women, black women in particular, as being absolutely out of place in polite white society. And the way that he's doing that here is to suggest that you have a slender white woman, relatively, and she is going to town with a black male musician, okay? And this was before Drake. But the idea is integration is a problem. We don't want our white women losing their morals. But the bigger problem is that if we allow integration, now all of a sudden, the black women whose bodies were violable throughout all of slavery are supposed to be courted? Oh my gosh, they're supposed to be treated like equals? So let's have this fat black woman on the couch and a white man kneeling before her? No. This was supposed to gin up terror at the idea that black people would exist within white spaces, right? And notice that they use the size of the black body to make a point, that she does not belong there. It also suggests that if we allow integration to proceed, white men will lose their seat, right? He's the only one who is not on the couch, which is a metaphor for losing their seat of power. And so we often think about intersectionality as being about individual identities. And that's probably not the most politically powerful way to think about it. It's more helpful for us to think about intersectionality as being about the relationality of outcomes, right? So in other words, what I talk about in the book is that black women's degradation is directly tied to the disciplining of white women and other non-black women. So in other words, there's always this way in which as white persons, you're supposed to be aware of the things that are associated with blackness and avoid them. Evidently, being degraded or disciplined in these ways are both wrong. Neither of these are acceptable. Now you may be saying, okay, sure. All of that took place historically, but aren't we supposed to be concerned about globesity, right? Everyone's suddenly supposed to be so frightened by the idea of obesity. What about that? Well, let's begin with eugenics. Now, you may not be aware, or perhaps you are, that the United States, yet again, is the country where this whole concern about obesity really took off. And it began with eugenics. So, eugenics, if you are unaware, as listed here, is the scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of racial improvement and planned breeding. Okay? That was popular during the early 20th century. This is Charles Davenport, who was a very prominent American eugenicist. He was one of the people trying to explain the so-called relationship between lead to greater and greater profits into the next decade. But we don't necessarily have to be involved with the whole question of traditional obesity culture anymore. There are so many people now who are activists for fat liberation, who are scholars, artists, writers, who are saying we do not need this. So, for example, you can take a look at the work of Chrissy King and the Body Liberation Project. One of the slides got missed. How'd that happen? Yeah. You might also read the work of Sonia Renee Taylor in The Body Is Not an Apology. And I love this definition that doesn't actually come from her book, but comes from the website Body Liberation Photos. Body liberation is freedom from social and political systems of oppression that designate certain bodies as more worthy, healthy, and desirable than others. Of course, fat phobia can impact anyone of any race or gender. But I have already articulated that at its origin, people were concerned with the idea that Black women were too fat. And so, as women, for those of you who in the audience who identify as such, I like this quote. It's a reminder that people are always trying to control our bodies, but we don't need validation from anyone. We should be fearless. Many people have been working in this space, just like Deshaun Harrison, shown here. I highly recommend their work, Belly of the Beast, because it's a reminder that when we understand that this is just not a matter of personal preference or what you're eating, right? But this is an example of state-based violence, then we can start to address it as a form of political activity, right? So instead of worrying about what parts of our bodies we should alter, what we need to change is the culture. So to conclude, fat phobia is rooted in anti-Blackness. And since women are often judged based on their appearance, it has had a greater impact on women historically. Fat stigma is a eugenic affectation, and it is still with us. Significantly, it propels poor health outcomes. But doesn't it make so much money? It's one of the reasons why people continue to use BMI. But that doesn't mean that this is the end of the story. There are many people who are working to dismantle these systems of oppression. And we can get involved, we can celebrate our bodies, and we can also fight the state-based violence that tells us that we need to change who we are to be acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really amazing and eye-opening. I think I'd like to begin by a small little anecdote as the first time that we met. So it's very interesting. 2 days ago, there was a talk with a kind of conversation afterwards with Louise Souvagi, and she was talking about fatness and fitness. And I met Louisa when I was editing the special issue of Recto Verso on fatness. It was called The Dick. You can still find it online. And we had approached Sabrina as well for an interview about the book because it had come out in 2019. And I think the special issue would come out in September of 2020. So I had interviewed you via Zoom for it. And I remember also you talking about that you've been to Belgium before. And now you're here again, so welcome. It's been a few years since then. It's nice to have you. So yeah, I just wanted to mention as well that the event with Louisa was also recorded and will be available via the YouTube channel of Studium Generalis. So if you ever want to watch it again, it will be available there, especially for the students. So let's get into it. You talk in the beginning about what inspired you to do this work and was fueled by your own personal experiences with your grandmother. By the way, my mom and I also used to watch a lot of Young and the Restless. Yeah. Not here. Okay. We used to get them in back home in Kenya. And so we would watch them on the local channels would every episode would come. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so yeah, and we used to watch it. And I know the Victoria you're talking about.
I know Victoria.
Yeah. Very skinny. All of them were really, really skinny. This is the one thing that I also never understood, but that's probably something for another time. And how everyone had these perfect eyebrows. I never really understood that. But it was one of the ways we were really introduced to this whole beauty standard, a very Western beauty standard that was not ours. It was one of the ways it kind of like seeped into how we consumed media, which is also an important thing, but we can talk about later. I wanted to ask if, while you were doing your research on the connection between fatphobia and racism, if you came across other research that's made that same connection, and if you didn't, how was your research kind of received in the beginning?
Yeah. In about 2012, there was another author, another Black woman, I believe her name is Andrea Shaw, and she had written a book about the unruly nature of the Black fat feminine body. And this one wasn't suggesting that fatphobia was inherently anti-Black, just that when Black women take up space, it makes people uncomfortable, and that's a reason to do it. Right. So, that's around about the time I was finishing my dissertation. So I was reading that book and I was thinking, that this book is going in a similar direction. And subsequently, there have been so many books that have been written that have been talking about this relationship and then taking it to questions of like masculinity and queerness. And so for those of you who are interested, again, Belly of the Beast takes up some of these issues. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
That how your research was received once you had published it.
Oh, yeah. So when I started doing this work in graduate school, maybe because there hadn't been that many people who had worked on this, I was discouraged repeatedly. I'm so fortunate that I had an amazing and supportive, wonderful committee because they were there with me the whole way. They believed in what I was doing. But, random professors at my school when I was in graduate school would be like, no, I feel like somebody already did that. Didn't Kim Chernin do that? They were naming a bunch. Didn't Susan Bordeaux do that? They kept naming a bunch of white ladies. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that even though these second wave feminists did work on fatphobia, most of it was about white women. And so, no, they did not do that. So then once I completed the dissertation, and then I'm, a postdoc at Berkeley, that was a really interesting experience. Because again, there were people who saw the value in what I was doing, and most of them were in sociology. But my primary appointment was in public health, and they did not like what I was doing over there, which is interesting because I had written the application and they were the ones who selected me. But I don't know what they thought they were gonna get. But once I was there, they were like, I remember there was a woman, a Black woman, in fact, working there who was like, this work is dangerous, And I was like, how is it dangerous? How is it dangerous to show that we don't need BMI and that we lead to worse health outcomes when we tell fat people they have to lose weight when they don't? So it was just the very idea that you would challenge the hegemony. I think is what people were concerned about. And not just that, but for so many of them, as they started to admit, they made their careers correlating things to BMI. Oops, BMI is correlated to cancer, like that kind of stuff, right? It's extremely lucrative, as I've mentioned several times, to toss around BMI.
And was it hard for you to make the link between racism and fat phobia?
No, but it came about in an unusual way.
Okay.
That I didn't really
Tell
get
us.
into in this presentation. So when I decided that, okay, clearly it didn't happen just with Twiggy in 1960, and I started to find some of these earlier reports like the Harper's, I was reading through a lot of women's magazines, and a lot of them were talking about Irish women. And I was like, what? Where are these Irish women in my data? I'm like, what is... But it turns out that in the 19th century, as I also alluded to, there were a bunch of people who we would today consider white that at that time were provisional. They weren't sure they were going to be admitted, right? And Irish people were among them. In the 17th, well, more so I think in the 18th and the 19th centuries, there were a number of people who were writing about the Irish as being part Negroid. That's what they would say. And even some of the early Aryan literature that people were producing was suggesting, again, well, the Irish people, the Celtic people, we think that they're part Negroid or part Africanoid, they would sometimes say. And so it was through that mechanism that I was able to trace the relationship between fatphobia and racism, curiously, with a group of people that today would mostly be considered white.
And yeah, it's very interesting to see how these kinds of things are quite fluid when they serve a certain status quo or a certain power. I'm wondering if it's still the same today, if it's now that the book has been out for upwards of 5 years, if it's still hard to make that connection today. I remember right around the time the book had come out, I did a workshop about it, and there was someone who was very staunchly against the idea that racism could be linked to something like fatphobia. And even on the comments of one of the Instagram comments on this event, somebody writes like, "This is the most crazy assumption that I've ever seen," or something like that. So I was wondering if you still feel like that's true today, to make that connection.
I think that person doesn't understand what research is, because when I've provided you with empirical research, you don't get to claim it's an assumption. But yes, I do still get that. In fact, only last month, first of all, conservatives hate me. I take on obesity and romance. They're like, no, these are things we care about. So I'm on a lot of conservative spaces, and I'm like, wow. And one of my students told me I was on a professor watch list. You're a professor watch list? And I'm like, I don't doubt it. I'm always being attacked by conservatives. And so just last month, there was a new Reddit thread about this book that came out in 2019. And they were like, somebody tell me what's wrong with it. Like, give me something. And who knows what they came up with. I'm sure they might have made up something. But the very idea that people are still talking about this and thinking about this, and that the movement is growing, I didn't start the movement, and it has in no way ended with me, that there are so many people in this space who care about this now, is terrifying for them. Because again, it hurts their bottom line. Also, it hurts their philosophy of life. They want people to be thin. They want to look at and think about thin people. So when you say it's okay to be the size that you are, or when you say you don't have to have a romantic relationship to be happy in your life, people are like, no, that's undermining our values.
And I'm guessing there's also another argument that this is just another Black person making something about race again. Is that also something that you come up against a lot?
Isn't it hilarious how 100% of the people who created race science were white guys, but now whenever you try to reveal to them what their ancestors did, nuh-uh, you made that up because Black people no. When I go into the archives and show you what your ancestors said, you don't get to tell me that Black people made it up.
Maybe to build on that, especially for the students in the audience, the talk is called Fatphobia and as misogynoir. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what misogynoir is specifically.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, I should define the terms. So misogynoir is the type of racism that accrues specifically to Black women, because just like so many other things, whenever we start talking about oppression, the people who often rise to the fore are going to be the people who are most privileged. So historically, when people have talked about racism anti-Black racism, the face of that ends up being a Black man. And so part of what I find it's important to do is to remind people that there are types of racism that are more likely to affect Black women.
All right. I was also thinking about maybe what other kinds of eye-opening information you came across while you were doing this research. I think you also talked about this idea of race being quite fluid, like, for example, Irish people not being considered white and now very much being considered white. Were there other eye-opening pieces of information you came across while you were doing this research?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because we live in a world of political correctness, at least in my country, or at least before the most recent election. But so you can't imagine that the New York Times would be promoting like some of the most vile, racist, fatphobic stuff. I mean, but like I use a lot of popular magazines and newspapers in my book to show like, hey, this was mainstream. We today would want to be more polite to people and probably wouldn't say this kind of stuff to their face. But at that time period, anything went. And there was even, the New York Times was involved in something known as the promotion of the American beauty, which is that they were trying to find out who was the most attractive woman in America. You're like, wait, isn't that a beauty pageant? But no, this was an actual like series of news features that appeared in a variety of top newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in which they were like, okay, this type of woman whose father is French and his mother who's Scottish, she's the most ideal woman. Like you can't imagine them doing that kind of stuff, but they were deeply racialized with it in the late 19th and early 20th century, because who were they going to be offending? People they didn't really care about.
Kind of reminds me of these magazines that keep on talk about how we would look in 100 years, and it's all racially ambiguous people.
Not likely.
Like it's every manner of racial ambiguous that you could ever think of, and I'm like, oh wow, it's a lot of erasure is going on here. A lot of stories are being told just by this one picture. It's interesting how these stories actually inform how we think, and also how we feel. Like desirability, most people do not feel like who they are attracted to is something political when it actually is. And I think one of the things that the fat liberation movement asks us to do is really think about that as a political act as well. Like, why are you attracted to who you're attracted to, and what has informed that? But you also talk about how that this work is not something that is fat liberation movement is not something that just started in the 60s or something. Could you please elaborate on that? Like, I think I came across in one of the interviews I was doing for research for this conversation, about the NAAFA or something like that.
Yeah. The NAAFA.
The NAAFA. Yeah.
So not a lot of people realize that there were just so many colliding movements going on in the 1960s in the United States and really globally. People think about the civil rights movement. Obviously, that was an important movement. People don't realize that also by the tail end of the 1960s, there were a growing number of people who were stepping forward and saying, we are fat activists. We have the right to live in the bodies that we are in without anybody trying to change us. And one of the most prominent groups at the time was a group known as the Fat Underground. And that group ultimately transformed into the NAAFA, the National Association for the Advancement of Fat Acceptance, which is still going today. Actually, one of my good friends is the executive director. But this group, as you might imagine, faced tremendous resistance in society. Think about being in the middle of a social movement where queer people are starting to say we have a right to be here. Women are like, no, we have the right to work outside the home. Black people are like, we are ending segregation. And then fat people are also like, we have a right to exist in the bodies that we're in. And obviously, every single last one of those groups faced resistance. And fat people faced a tremendous amount of resistance, even sometimes from the other groups. And so this is one of the reasons why I feel like it's so important to think about our lives as connected and to think about intersectionality in this way. Not just about what are the various social oppressions or privileges that create my identity, but what are the ways in which my life is tied to your life. We won't be free as people who are considered straight size while fat people are still being stigmatized. Freedom is collective.
Exactly. When you talk about intersectionality, it makes me think about the many ways or many times I've had to explain what intersectionality is, but also about this book that was released in, this is another piece of lore. I'm giving you a lot of lore. A book that was released in the Netherlands about, it was, I think in Dutch it's called the Zeven de Vinkjes. So it's the seven identity markers, I guess. And it kind of just really bastardized intersectionality and made it about something like, oh yeah, this, if you have this many identities, then you're this much oppressed. Oh, no. And it kind of makes you think about this very superficial way of dealing with racism and the effects of racism, because you also talk about the Renaissance woman, how that the bigger body was valued and valorized, but this changed, and when it changed, the people were reluctant to think about the why and the how, and to think about the intersectionality of it all, and to understand, oh yeah, there might be a reason why this is happening right now. And so this is superficiality when it comes to the way people engage with these kinds of topics. Do you find that there's some kind of intentionality behind it, or is it the fact that there isn't, and that's why it's so superficial in the first place?
I like that question. I feel like it's a little bit of laziness and fatigue, because, you know, in the 60s, when people were starting to talk about racism, it was relatively new. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure people had discussed it in their homes and amongst their friends, but it was one of the first times, at least in the public life of my country, where people would be in the streets saying this is racist and this is wrong, right? People were forced to confront their own bigotry. Now, you know, 60 years past some of the most important legislation that had been enacted in the United States, people are like, what? We're still talking about this? What? DI, what? So there's a sense that we've already said this before, that we already know this stuff. And I'm going to tell you, one of the things I'm working on right now is trying to unsettle even liberal people. Because in the class that I just taught, and I really enjoy teaching undergraduates. It's just so much fun. It's joyous. But I have started to notice a sort of like sedimentation of values. And so I'll ask students, like, what is racism? And I was like, okay, they can't define this. Because most people think racism, like I've said already, is when you hate someone. That's not what racism is. They didn't enslave my ancestors because they hated them. They wanted to benefit from them. They wanted to profit. Racism is about profiting and dehumanizing. And so I'm working on a project right now so I can help people understand that racism is so much more than we realize, because capitalism was built on the backs of slavery, which means so many of the various forms of infrastructure that you encounter every day were made possible by racism. So we don't get to start playing like, oh, I have a Black person in my class, right? That's not good enough. We need to reimagine the way in which we do pretty much everything in our society, because so much of it was founded on enslavement and dehumanization.
Yeah. I think there's also a certain amount of honesty about the roles that the systems you benefit from played in that, you know. And I think that's hard for people to sit with sometimes, because it can also then be flattened to, okay, I have privilege, how do I then use my privilege? And then it becomes something transactional almost, instead of a deep understanding of the role you play within a system that is oppressive to everyone, but in different ways, and therefore has an effect in different ways, right? That space for nuance, that space for sitting in what makes people uncomfortable is almost not allowed to exist. And that's something I have a hard time with, because I feel like if we could do that, then we could have more honest conversations about, you know, this is how we got here. Let's think of, let's imagine new ways of being that could be equitable for everyone, right?
You know, I do want to say to that, there's a Fred Moten quote, and I won't give the whole quote because it's profane, but it's basically like, yeah, racism is killing me, but it's killing you too, however softly. Like, you don't notice all of the ways in which you're being managed as a white person, all the things you can't do. being white. And it's not just white people who are racist. Like so much of the ways in which we experience racism is that we're in a culture where we have these assumptions about other people. And often these assumptions go unchecked, right? And I'm sure we all think that we're not doing it, but you'd be surprised how frequently you might just be doing this kind of thing. You see a person on the street, and then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm across the street, right? Little things that happen every day that people do notice when they're against them.
Exactly. In the book, you talk about an aesthetic. I think I've said that. Aesthetic. And aesthetic. Exactly. Could you shed some light on that for us? Because you didn't have the time to do that with the presentation, and I think it would be interesting for people to know what that is.
Yeah. So when I started doing this research, I found out pretty quickly that a lot of the ideas that were supposed to be representations of Blackness actually came out of colonial environments in which people who were a little bit unsure about their status were trying to figure out what made them superior, right? So in other words, it's not as if they simply went to a country and were like, oh, we're just simply chronicling as objective researchers how these people behave. They were like, no, let's try to figure out ways that they're doing something that we find vile and define ourselves in opposition. And so this is how we came to the aesthetic. As there were a very minimal number of colonial reports coming back to the Western nations of Europe about some of the practices in Africa, in certain countries in Africa, they would sensationalize like some things that they were known as like fattening festivals. And they would be like, did you know if you go to this one location, you might find that the men really want their women to be fat, so they're feeding them. And like these small little reports of things that they may have seen or maybe even have fabricated in various locations, because their reports are all that we have, right? We can't verify that now. So they either saw this in these pockets or they fabricated it entirely, and then they used that to paint an entire population, right? And so this is how they came up with the aesthetic. They're like, okay, we're finding that in Africa, as we saw, people have to be 21 stone. Well, we don't want to be that. We want to be skinny, and that's how we know we're superior.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also mentioned that religion becomes a way to kind of use this aesthetic as an ideal to decide who is an ideal person, like the ideal good Christian person. And I think that's something that would be interesting to kind of elaborate on. How could you use institutions like the Catholic Church, for example, to do something like this?
Yeah. So in the United States, which is a largely Protestant nation, or at least it was historically, there was the sense that there was the sense amongst many of the Protestants that there was something unholy about eating too much. So they would talk about temperance at the table all the time. There were a variety of different temperance movements that swept the United States in the 19th century. Some of them were obviously, about prohibition surrounding alcohol, but there was also a number of movements and even societies against overeating, right? Movements against overeating. So the idea was that we want to live right by God. And God doesn't want us to overeat, right? Gluttony, supposedly one of the 7 sins. So we need to show that we know how to be proper Christians when we're eating.
Proper Christians when we're eating. I think I switched the Protestants with the Catholics because Belgium is a Catholic.
Okay,
yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So when we talk about fatness and obesity, you've already talked about the body mass index, which was based on Adolf Quetelet's earlier work, an interesting piece of lore. The building that my department used to be in, the basement building my department used to be in, was named after him. And I studied African languages and cultures. It's
that history.
The irony is hilarious when I think about it. We've moved now. We are now in the different building, and no longer in the basement, but we were there for a very long time. So you call BMI also a kind of colorblind racism. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So we think of racism mostly as being color conscious. We look at someone And based on their skin color, hair textures, nose size, body size, we're like, okay, this person is this race, and they have these characteristics, not just physical, also supposedly behavioral. And based on what their race is, I know where they are in the hierarchy, I know I get to treat them, right? That's basically how it goes. But when we think about sort of colorblind racism, this is the kind of racism in which, okay, we're going to pretend that there's no social oppressions whatsoever. And we're just going to select a group of, almost always, middle class and wealthy white guys to represent all of humanity. This erases the differences that exist amongst us. And it's not differences that are rooted in some type of biological idea of race, but in our social reality. In our social reality, we have many different ways of being in the world, partly because of racial categorizations, but partly outside of them, because of our ethnicity, because of our culture, because of our nationality. So colorblind racism is insidious because it has existed in medicine for a very long time. And what it does is that it yet again uses white men as the standard bearers for humanity.
It reminds me of all the studies that were done in the United States about Black women and pregnancy related deaths, and also the op-ed that Serena Williams wrote about Black women and not being believed when they're in pain, because there's this idea that they can handle a lot of pain, or that they are lying about the pain that they're feeling because they want access to different types of drugs. So this kind of medical racism has existed for a very long time. I think for me, I encountered it as well when I was writing a paper about these different stereotypes of Black women, and I came across Saartje Baartman as well, and also the 16-year-old enslaved girl who I think his name is James Sims, experimented on with most of the gynecological
Anarcha and Betsy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I think about that, I also think about the medicalization of Black bodies, but also of this idea of fatness as well. You have on one side, of course, the politicization, and then you also have the medicalization. And I want to start with the medicalization and the effect this has on how Black people are treated by healthcare professionals. If you think, like the first time we spoke, it was also during COVID, so I remember asking you a question about whether or not you think COVID would have brought the way Black people experience medical racism to the forefront so that people can talk about it, because there were also these ideas of, Black people are dirty, that's why they're not washing their hands, that's why they are having more cases of COVID. And at the time you told me that there were not necessarily any studies that you could point to. And I was wondering if you think that has changed, if with people as famous as Serena talking or penning her experience about what it was to give birth to Olympia, if these kinds of conversations have moved a little bit to the forefront.
I don't think so, unfortunately. I think a lot of the same things are going on. Largely because they sort of appear as a flash in the pan. Like someone like Serena will say, I experienced this, and people will say that's terrible. And then they'll go back to looking at what they're looking at on Netflix. I mean, we're living in a society where it's so easy to just shut your mind off about serious issues. And unfortunately, we do that quite a bit. And when I say society, I'm talking about Western society, but also especially the country that I'm from. And so it's so difficult to have a sustained awareness that can actually lead to change. When we're busy thinking about, okay, wait, I have to pay my bills. Oh my gosh, I have to go to work. Now that I'm off work, the only thing I want to do is just relax, right? So our lives are so stressful and so disconnected that being able to address critical issues is actually getting a lot harder. And so this is one of the things I think about. It's like the internet has given us a lot, but it's also taken so much from us. It's taken a lot of the ways in which we might have had just everyday, pleasant, or even political conversations with strangers on the street. I was at this hardware store in California as I recently moved, and I was just sort of like buying some supplies. And the woman who worked there was a little bit older. She's a white woman, and we were just talking about like American politics, and we were both like, this never happens anymore. Like two random people getting together and expressing their sentiments about what's going on. Normally, if you would be in a store like that, she'd be looking for something to help you and you'd be on your phone, right? So there's a way in which there's organizing made possible through social media, but there's also other forms of connectivity that are dwindling with social media.
Yeah, it's very hard to build community online.
Yeah.
I think if we were to look at liberation movements from the past, the one thing they did do was really invest in that physical time with one another. Even pamphleting, stuff like that doesn't happen anymore. So it's hard to kind of mobilize people to do more than just post something or to do more than just be online. But I was thinking also about. Just to come back on the COVID and when the vaccine first came out and the reticence that Black people had to be one of the first people to take the vaccine, especially if you think about the ways in which it has been experimented with Black people in the past, this makes sense. And the mistrust of medical professionals, it makes sense. I was wondering if there is a way for us to work against that bias in order for us to kind of hold up the health of our communities.
Under COVID, there was something insidious going on in which they decided, again, I'm speaking from my country, they decided that the people who would get access to the vaccine first were people with elevated BMIs. And so that was divisive, and I'm sure that was intentional. Because there were so many people, myself included, who were writing like high-profile op-eds against the way in which COVID regulations were rolling down. And then they decided, okay, well, here we're going to use BMI in this fashion. Now, if you're a kind of person who, takes Ozempic for weight loss, or, maybe you got a COVID vaccine early based on BMI, I'm not in any way trying to shame an individual who has made these choices. I'm only trying to help put a frame on how these were presented to you as choices. Part of what they were doing is saying, okay, we're revalidating these tools that people from many different disciplines have shown to be invalid by giving you a benefit. Like, we're going to give you this benefit. And so to your question about like the experimentation on Black people and then giving, obviously Black people who have elevated BMIs were some of the first people to get the COVID vaccine. It's hard to see it as something that can be troubling if it feels like something that's almost a privilege. And I think this is true for a lot of the ways in which privileges happen, even white privilege. I mean, there are various ways in which I think white people imagine that their lives are so much better because of their privileges. And here's an example. There's a student at UC Irvine where I used to work who was doing a fascinating project on environmental pollution. And one thing that she found is that there is a tremendous amount of environmental pollution in unexpected places, in middle-class white spaces. And she would talk to people as part of her research, like, hey, did you know that there was this refinery here? Did you know? And people would be like, well, no, we're not living in a poor area. Like, they would literally think that these kinds of things don't happen to them because they're white. And so it was a really fascinating project because it reveals how, this sort of like convoluted racial thinking leads people down paths that can be harmful.
That they sometimes don't even realize.
They don't realize because they think they're privileged.
They're privileged, exactly.
Yeah.
So I can imagine this is a question you get a lot. So if BMI is not something that we can use to gauge somebody's health, what can we then use to gauge somebody's health and wellness?
Yeah, I like the way you phrased it, because oftentimes when I tell people, okay, BMI should not be used at all. Like, this is not even a medical tool. It was created by an astronomer. And they'll be like, well, what else can we use to tell people they're too fat? And I'm like, well, we don't need anything to tell people that. We can take people as they arrive on an independent basis. And this happens all the time when people are rich. That's the other thing that's important. I know a Black woman, I won't say her name because you know her too. She's a famous Black woman. And she and I were talking about this because she's a fat Black woman and she's wealthy, so she has what we call concierge medical care in the United States. And she's like, when I go to a traditional doctor, when she used to, they would take her weight and immediately tell her to lose weight. That's all they would do. But now that she has concierge medical care, they do a complete workup of her when she goes in and presents for an illness. So in other words, she goes in and she might have bronchitis, and rather than being told to lose weight, they try to figure out what is actually going on in her body. That's what everyone deserves. There are so many different reports of people who have gone to the doctor, for example, saying that they have some type of pain, being told to lose weight, and then sent on their way. And then later, it comes out they had cancer. The cancer was missed because the doctor was busy trying to put them in a box. So what we deserve is holistic medical care.
Yeah, and even in countries where you think, okay, we have free medical care, then this should be something that you have. You just not. No. So I broke my leg. I broke my ankle in 2 places, and when I was healing, the first thing they told me was, yeah, you have to lose a lot of weight because you've now broken your ankle and it might not be able to support your weight. And I was like, wait a minute. This leg has been supporting me my whole life. Why would it not now? Like, why would it change? But it was this undercurrent of almost every single appointment that I had afterwards. Like, yeah, you should really think about losing weight. You should really think about losing, because they also couldn't find a boot to fit my ankle.
That means they should create new sizes of boots.
Yeah,
like
no. They just gave me a different one, and they were like, yeah, it's not going to be as stable as that one. Just make sure you don't fall again.
Wow. No, I mean, it's outrageous.
It's really crazy. Not to mention, of course, gynecology and being a woman and going to the gynecologist and being overweight and being told that every single gynecological problem you have is based on your weight. So it's something that's really quite international, regardless of whether or not you have free healthcare. I mean, alhamdulillah for the free healthcare, always. But you still have to kind of navigate these ways in which the body, or especially at least the fat black body, is thought about.
I just want to add to that. So when I go to the doctor, they find that I have fibroids. Most of the time it's not a big deal. There's just sort of like these non-cancerous tumors that exist within my uterus. But sometimes I might experience, breakthrough bleeding. You need not to know all of this, but the point that I'm making is that I've had multiple ultrasounds, and each time I go to the doctor, they're always like, "You have fibroids. You're not overweight." And they just like start buffering. They're just like, they have nowhere else to go with it, right? It's like, hey, don't you think we should try to figure out why so many black women have fibroids? It's clearly not that, so stop telling us that. But it blows my mind when I go to the doctor, and so many times I'll tell them about my symptoms, and they'll be like, "It's not the weight. It's not." They don't know what else to do. They're just like, they're out of options.
It's really, when I got diagnosed with fibroids, that's the same thing they told me. It's like, yeah, it happens a lot with black women. We don't know why. Yeah. It's like, maybe you should find out.
Maybe there should be some research into that.
Yeah.
Because,
it's hereditary. That's all we know. It happens a lot to people from Africa. Black women from Africa. It's like, okay.
And nothing else in 50 years?
Anyway, so now that we've talked about, I would like to just move to the politicization of marginalized bodies, and fat bodies are some of those marginalized bodies. And we are looking at how now with the rise of the far right, also this valorization of skinniness, of smallness. The beauty ideal is also changing. You're seeing famous people change their bodies again, and all of a sudden they are not racially ambiguous anymore. Now they are white and they are smaller, and they're the bums are getting smaller, the breasts are getting smaller, things are getting smaller.
You're talking about Kim Kardashian?
I'm talking about Kim Kardashian. And there is this link that's being made to the rise of the far right, and also this idea that that they can also, and Deshaun Harris talks about this as well, as the beauty with a big B privilege, and Melissa Harris Perry also talks about it in Sister Citizen, about black women growing up or being born in a crooked room, and all their entire lives being about straightening the room and realizing there's the room that's crooked and not them. And while I was doing some research on this, I found next to fat liberation as ugly politic, the idea that being ugly is or being considered ugly is a liberation. It creates space for you to do something, to move differently, to think about life differently, to think about your place in it differently. And I was wondering, seeing on the one side this kind of link between skinniness and the rise of the far right, and on the other side, fat liberation and that kind of growing movement of considering ugliness a politic. If you had come across that since you've written the book and are seeing kind of the parallels as well with something that you might have researched for the book.
I didn't research that for the book, but I think you're absolutely right. And I feel like that's happened, more recently. I feel like that's growing within like maybe within the past handful of years. And I think it's the expected backlash from minoritized people rising up and asserting their power and their confidence in who they are and expecting to be respected. Inevitably, whenever you do something like that, the power structure is going to fight back. Mm-hmm. And so what we're seeing is that reverberation. So I've talked a little bit about how like I've been on these conservative shows, or sometimes conservative people who are well known will just be talking about me on their platform or posting about me on their platform. And you can tell that the fear is that the things that they value, the things that they like might go away. The thing that is a reality is that they feel as if they have to force their values on everyone to make sure that they still exist. And so until we can figure out how to live in a world in which we allow individuals just to be how they would like, we're always going to find that once we start talking about the issues that we experience as minoritized persons, they're going to come back even more vociferously with their values. I mean, think about what's going on with trans rights. There are so many different ways in which for a very long time, people didn't know what transness was, right? And now that it's much more visible, it is so much more political. There's always some person, including recently my very own governor, Gavin Newsom, sort of like, should we let trans kids play sports? It's like, why would we not let trans kids? I mean, the whole thing is so outrageous, but it's the fear coming from people in positions of power and authority that if we don't do what they say, they won't be in power anymore, right? So it's this desire to make sure that they maintain their control and their status.
It's when I think about it, I really do think about these connections in a way that, how do we then kind of make them legible? Make them something that we can talk about in these spaces. You're talking about like in a grocery store where we can come across people and say, you know what, it's something I've been noticing this link between the way we're perceiving bodies and marginalization and the rise of a certain kind of politic, and it's making me and I'm getting a little anxiety about it. How do you feel? There's those kinds of things. That's what I think about as well. To kind of conclude, I wanted to ask if there was, because you talked about a little bit in the end, the cover of the book, and I was thinking about this kind of, as a researcher myself, I'm always kind of thinking about what it is that I want to share, who I'm sharing it with, and why I'm sharing it. And Saartje Baartman is a story that I've talked about before also as well. But I wonder sometimes, considering like parts of her body parts were only just sent back like in 1994 to South Africa after South Africa asked for them to be sent back so she could actually be buried properly. I was thinking about if you kind of also hold that tension as a researcher yourself about what you choose to depict and why you choose to depict it. This is personally for me, this question.
Oh yeah, no, this is an interesting question. It's funny because I was just thinking about a paper that I wrote years ago when I was doing my yoga teacher training. There happened to be a Black man who was found guilty of, I think he ransacked a couple of like yoga studio entryways and like maybe stole a couple of wallets or whatever. And so anyway, he went to prison. Probably just to jail, which is a difference in the United States, and was there for like a few months. And then when he got out, somehow a lot of these yoga studio owners knew that he got out. And they had orchestrated a whole campaign to recriminalize him. They were literally trying to find out where he was at what time. Like, I saw him here, I saw him there. I'm like, wait a minute. This man has paid his debt, right? He does not get to be labeled a perpetual yoga criminal. That literally at the yoga studio where I was training, there was a huge picture of his face. Like, this man is out of prison again. Like, or it's like, watch out for your wallet. I mean, meanwhile, he probably stole like probably a couple of $100s worth of stuff. And so then I started to confront them like, hey, you got to take this photo down. And then there was the question of when I wrote the piece about it, should we use the photo? And ultimately, we determined that we would not use the photo for this very reason. It's like, okay, when you're trying to do this kind of social justice work, part of what you have to negotiate is, will the dissemination of these materials lead to a greater awareness and harm, right? Which would have been what happened if we had used this photo. So to your question, I think a lot about the ways in which it's important to highlight the ways in which Black people are often criminalized or dehumanized, but also try to talk about it in a way that doesn't continue that cycle. It's not always easy to do that. But I try to make the effort, especially when representing Sarji Bartman, to show the different sides of her character and to tell you more about who she was as a human being, so that you don't just see her the way she was seen by the colonists and the people who went to the exhibits as a curiosity. You get to understand a little bit about her biography so that you know that she is a human being.
It's a very difficult tension to kind of navigate. It's to decide when to and when not to. I'm trying to sit with the uncomfortableness of it all and decide for myself. So now I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but we have a very engaged audience that has been watching us for over an hour now. So I would like to pass the ball to them and see if they have any questions for Sabrina. And I can't read. Okay, now I can see you better.
Okay. Hello? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh,
This is amazing.
That's me.
So I was wondering how the Black male body or the objectification of the Black male body can be introduced in a conversation like this one. And if you came across the objectification of Black male body when you were investigating this subject.
Yeah. So it just so happens that we were talking about this backstage because one of your colleagues has actually been talking about doing a project on this. And no, not to crib his work, let's say his name because I don't remember his name.
Eric.
Okay, so Philson's friend Eric had been doing a project in which he was investigating the way in which to be fat as a Black man was wrong because you're supposed to be buff, right? So for Black women, the problem is you're supposed to be thin, right? Because white women, you know, are told to be thin and they're supposed to be leading the way. But for Black men, you're supposed to be buff and strong like a mandingo or a buck, right? I think that's like a fascinating project because the fat phobia is there, but the body modification is different. But we also see that fat phobia becomes a justification for the brutalization of Black men, right? So many of you may be familiar with Eric Garner. And like so much of the conversation surrounding Eric Garner was, he's just so big. He was just so big. We had to figure out a way to subdue him, right? So like a tall, fat Black man being a threat to a police officer, whereas he's not doing anything but simply standing in front of a store, right? So we see that there is the policing of the Black male body, but that it shows up in a different way.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Any other questions? Who can we pass the cube to? Come on, y'all. I know you have questions.
Oh, here's some.
Here at the front. Maybe just pass it.
Oh, do I show it? Do I pass it?
Maybe pass it.
Yeah, like hand to hand.
Yeah, hand to hand.
Okay, hand in hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Hello. what a weird object. Okay. Hello, thanks a lot for today. First, I have two things to say. I have a question and I have first something to address. I'm really grateful that fatphobia and anti-blackness are part of programmation, which is super rare, I don't know. So just for that already, I'm super thankful for tonight. My first remark will be for the venue. That is, as I said, amazing to have this in the programmation, but the reality of it, as a fat woman, I'm seated on a chair for more than an hour. That is really small for me. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to be able to have this on stage that is addressed, but the reality of it, the accessibility of the venues are still not following. Again, this is not a critique against the venue by itself, because they facilitate this moment, but I think there is a lot of reality to address, that it's still amazing to have research about that, but in a political and sociological, sorry, my English, there is still a lot of reality that are not addressed at all. So I think that, yeah, we need to do still a lot of effort about accessibility. So yeah, sorry, that was just, it was not a question.
No,
That's fine.
Voilà. And then I had a question I wanted to ask you, and it's not a trick or a trap question, but do you have some advice, more on a political level, how to make fatphobia recognized as a discrimination by itself? Because this is one of the discrimination that is still acceptable.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And in order for any form of discrimination to be made unacceptable, there has to be a movement behind it. And so this is something that I sort of talk about frequently when I give talks in the US. And quite honestly, I increasingly turn down talks in the US because people want to show up and hear me say these things, and then like, how do we fix it? And I'm like, okay, we need to organize ourselves to have a campaign against physicians who want to use BMI, and then people are like, no, what do I say to my doctor? Right? It's like, how do I feel better in my body? It's like, well, you aren't going to be able to do that as an individual. You have to find like-minded persons with whom you can collaborate to make your voices heard. One person being upset about something, that's just a personal problem. But thousands of people being upset about something, now that's a political problem. So I would say that, you know, it really would behoove you to try to find other folks who feel similarly and to start making your voices heard.
Collective action. All right, any more questions? Yes, back there. You can pass it back again, thank you.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm very fascinated by the idea of fatness, or not cultivating like an ideal body type, is seen as a moral failure, in the sense that we all have like some kind of moral responsibility to cultivate this perfect ideal body. But this logic of taking care of your body being like a moral virtue doesn't always hold up across the board. It's like fatness is kind of singled out between things like smoking, where you are actively harming your body in a very purposeful way, or and this is often like smoking is closer to cool. I mean, it's kind of the mindset around smoking is changing a lot recently, but it was seen as cool for a long time, even though you are more actively harming your own body than a fat person is harming their body by not being skinny or trying to get skinny. So why are we so obsessed with this moral failure aspect of it when it comes to how large you are, but not when you harm your body in other ways? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And thank you for your question. I think it has a lot to do with what people want in their lives, right? And frequently, and this was, definitely true about racism in America for a very long time, people simply did not want to see certain types of individuals in their environment. For example, as I was showing you the slide about integration, they don't want to see Black people in their space at all. There are a lot of people who are bigoted around the simple idea of seeing fat people. And I think that's, for some folks, that's hard to grasp because you're like, well, this is their individual body, this is their personal life. But we live in a culture in which people do express quite commonly the sense that they don't believe that fat people should have a right to exist, right? And this is one of the things that I sometimes say when I'm talking about this issue. I'm like, the whole idea of naming obesity an epidemic and then globesity an epidemic is to suggest that we should eradicate fat people. Fat people have always existed and they will always exist. And it's funny that you bring up smoking because at the Berkeley School of Public Health, when I was a postdoc, that was what they were doing. They were like, we figured out how to make people stop smoking. Now, how do we shame them into making them stop eating? It's like, okay, well, one of them is unnecessary and the other one is vital for life. So there is this way in which people believe that they can change another individual's habits, right? They think that being fat is always about eating a certain amount, eating too much. Whereas there are myriad reasons why people have different body sizes, right? And so because they have in their mind that this is like a sin, right? We live in a deeply Christian culture, that this is also what's driving this sense that it must be stopped.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Oh, a couple.
Ooh,
Oh, people, okay.
okay, y'all woke up.
Oh, there's somebody back right behind you.
Someone behind you.
Oh, is it?
Okay, you can pass it down. Ooh. Okay.
Okay. I just have a question, like regarding your book. It talks about the Western European like beauty standard, and I just have a question of, do you think like also the beauty standard of that is related also to colorism, like among people of color, basically?
Oh yeah, certainly. As soon as you said that, I was like, Halle Berry. I don't even know why, but Halle Berry was the first person who came to my mind. It's like, for a couple of decades even somehow in the United States, when people wanted to talk about an attractive Black woman, she would be the first person to come up. You know, she's obviously slender and very fair-skinned. And this is not to suggest that she is not beautiful, but when you're talking about a beautiful Black person, oh, Beyonce, oh, you know, Halle Berry, you know, it's just like the light-skinned ones come to mind first. And so you could be, let's say, a dark-skinned, slender Black woman, but I'm trying to think of a person like that who is considered like the epitome of beauty in America and nobody's coming to mind. And so I don't want to make it seem like Black women can't also have thin privilege, because we can, right? Any person who is slender can have thin privilege. But when you are darker skinned, you're not going to be able to reap the benefits as much as when you're lighter skinned, because you're getting closer and closer to the white ideal. Thank you.
Maybe we could go back to the back there. No?
Oh yeah, okay, good projection.
Yeah, very good projection.
Hi. First of all, I love your research and the things that you do.
Thank you.
I am preparing a PhD proposal in where I want to research disability in a historical context. And it's very similar to the work that you do, as in, for example, how do we frame contemporary problems in very long histories? And in trying to sort out my word packages and my research lines and whatever, like one of the big things that I am already finding is the connection historically in representation in between disability and class. Disabled people are poor, they wear rags, whatever, that's how we depict them. And I was wondering, considering the research that you've done and everything that we've seen today, I think I caught some snippets of it, but how does the identity marker of class and maybe specifically also poverty come into this story of everything that you told now? That's my question.
Yeah. You know, speaking contemporarily, what we find when we, you know, sort through the data as scientists is that the people who are going to be stigmatized for their size are those individuals who are going to have lower incomes. And, Berkeley School of Public Health is really getting it today. And I'm glad this is not going to be on YouTube because they won't see it. But yet again, when I was there was this whole conversation of like, how do we get poor people to eat better? They just want to eat junk food. There's all of this like moralizing and shaming. But the reality is that what we need to be thinking about is, yes, healthy food is often very expensive. At least it is in the United States. Have you heard of Whole Foods? It's, owned by the same guy who owns Amazon, right? Jeff Bezos. You could go there. There's so many comedians who have talked about it. You can go into Whole Foods and you can spend your entire weekly salary and you'd be like, I hope this is enough food for me to eat for the week. I mean, it's so absurd how expensive it is to get healthy, organic food, right? So in reality, low-income folks have less access to these kinds of resources. And so if we actually care about making our populations healthy, this is what we should prioritize. For a while, I was like, what if I could figure out a way to create a center at the school where I'm currently working where we simply give people stuff? Because research shows that helps. Instead of telling poor people how to spend their money, what if you just give them money? That actually works, right? And so definitely there's a classist angle because it allows people who have a certain amount of wealth and power to feel even more superior. They know how to eat, right? When in reality, they simply have the money to eat well.
And most of the time didn't eat well because they all had really bad gout and...
And then that's the other, in reality, when you look at it, plenty of middle class people eat all kinds of like Doritos and, McDonald's. And I'm not saying you can't eat that, right? All I'm saying is that those are the kinds of foods that they shame poor people for eating. Whereas in reality, all kinds of folks eat this food. Yeah. But the healthy food in particular, poor people rarely have access to that in my country.
That was a pretty important question. I'm glad you still acted for yourself as well. We have time for one more question. Way back there. Yeah, it's a microphone and it's so squishy so it can break.
It's like so cool, right?
Thank you. I want to ask, how do influencers like Nara Smith and all these like very beautiful, slender, light-skinned women influence this sort of hatred and this sort of phobia towards people who are a heavier weight and have a darker skin color?
I may not know that particular influencer as an old person, but I'm sort of familiar with these kinds of ideas, right? And one thing that I'm familiar with is the clean aesthetic. So you've probably seen that, like Hailey Bieber, these kinds of people. And that actually is functioning in a couple of ways. On the one hand, her aesthetic, like with the long nails and the slick bun, Black and Latina women have been doing that for decades. That is not a new thing. So on the one hand, there's an appropriation going on. But on the other hand, there's a way in which, by simply calling it clean, they're implying that there's a dirty, right? Oh, I'm clean, I'm rich and I'm white and I'm thin and look at, So definitely, what a lot of influencers do, it's not as if it's like in the past where, as I was describing, you could find some really vile stuff written in newspapers about people of color. They wouldn't do that. Instead, they simply take from them and visibilize them, and then also somehow make themselves seem different from them, right? It's a curious circuit. So it's like, okay, I've taken from Black folks in these ways, but the clean aesthetic is really about looking like me, right? Looking like a Hailey Bieber type. So to your question, it feels as if there's an appropriation and an invisibilization that takes place. There's always the implication that this is good. And so even though you don't have them showing you and telling you what's bad, you get to figure it out pretty easily.
Yeah, we come back to the stories we tell that shape how we think and why we think the way that we think, of course.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you all for your questions. I think I'm going to end with the last question and maybe ask you if there's something you would like to leave us with, to think about, to ruminate on.
I was thinking about what we were talking about previously. As we were sort of talking about social media a little bit, and we were just talking about this question as well. So there's a black revolutionary, Gil Scott-Heron. He's since passed on. But in the 1960s, I think maybe even a little bit later than that, maybe it was in the 70s, he had this iconic poem that he set to music, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." If you haven't seen it, please see it. He's considered the godfather of rap, partially for that one song. And it's a reminder that if we want to make change, we're not going to be able to do it sitting in front of our screens. You know, obviously, social media didn't exist. The internet didn't exist when he made the song, but the resonance is still there. Like, making change requires us to be in rooms with people, sharing our ideas, learning, educating ourselves, and then going out and fighting the power.
All right. Go out and find the power, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so great chatting with you again.
Yeah, it was fun. All right. Thank all of you for coming and sharing space with us. Thank you, Sabrina, for sharing your work with us again. It was really nice to talk to you again. Yeah, you don't gotta go home, but you gotta get the hell up out of here.
Okay.